Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. In the heart of a quiet little town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, there was an antique shop that always caught my attention. The facade was old, with exposed brick and a faded sign that said, Mr. Almeida's Antiques. The shop had an air of mystery, and Mr. Almeida himself, an elderly, frail-looking man, seemed to fit perfectly into the enigmatic atmosphere that surrounded the place. My name is Mariana. I decided to move to this city to escape the urban chaos and find some peace. I worked remotely as a graphic designer and loved the idea of living in a place where time seemed to have stood still. I rented an apartment in an old building next to the antique shop, and I soon realized that Mr. Almeida was my neighbor. From the first day, he was very friendly. He seemed genuinely happy to have a new resident in the building. He offered to help me move in and, with a friendly smile, said that I could visit him at the shop at any time. If you need anything at all, just knock here, he said, pointing to the door of his shop. I accepted his offer with a smile, but I couldn't ignore the strange feeling that invaded me every time I looked at the shop. There was something in Mr. Almeida's eyes that made me uneasy, as if he knew more than he was willing to reveal. For the first few days, life in the new apartment was peaceful. I was busy organizing my things and adapting to the new routine. However, at night, when the city fell silent, I began to notice strange things. Sounds coming from Mr. Almeida's apartment, like heavy footsteps and the scraping of furniture, echoed through the building. I tried to ignore them, but curiosity began to take over. One night, while trying to concentrate on work, I heard a loud noise coming from the hallway. I opened the door to my apartment and saw Mr. Almeida standing there, holding a garbage bag. He smiled when he saw me. "Oh, Mariana, sorry about the noise. I was just organizing some things in the store," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I smiled back, but an uneasy feeling remained. I decided that I needed to know more about my neighbor. Over the next few days, I began to discreetly investigate. I asked locals about Mr. Almeida and his store. I learned that he had lived there for decades, and that the antique shop was a popular spot in town. But I also heard disturbing rumors. Some people whispered that former residents of the building had mysteriously disappeared, and that Mr. Almeida knew more than he let on. My curiosity turned to concern. I needed to know the truth. One afternoon, I decided to accept Mr. Almeida's invitation and visited his store. He was organizing some old books when I walked in. "Ah, Mariana, how nice to see you. Come, let me show you some interesting pieces," he said, with that enigmatic smile. As he showed me his collection of antiques, I felt a growing uneasiness. The objects in the store seemed to carry dark histories, as if they were imbued with the essence of their former owners. There was something unsettling about each piece. "This one is one of my favorites," Mr. Almeida said, pointing to an old record player. "It belonged to a lady who lived in the building many years ago. Unfortunately, she disappeared, but the record player remained." His tone was casual, but the mention of another disappearance made me freeze. I asked more about the lady, but he just shrugged. "Oh, you know how it is. People disappear sometimes. The city is small, but the world is big." Something inside me knew there was more to the story. I decided to continue my investigations. I began to notice strange things in my own apartment. Objects would move around, lights would flicker inexplicably, and shadows would seem to move on the walls. The feeling of being watched would never leave me. One night when I came back from the market, I noticed that my door was ajar. I cautiously entered and saw that nothing seemed out of place, except for an old photo I had found in one of the cabinets. It was a picture of a young woman with a sad look in her eyes. The picture was now on my desk, and I knew I hadn't left it there. I decided to confront Mr. Almeida. I went to his shop, but it was closed. I knocked on his apartment door, but no one answered. The feeling of unease grew. I went back to my apartment, and that night I had terrible nightmares. I dreamed of the woman in the picture, screaming for help, while Mr. Almeida dragged her into the darkness. I woke up sweaty and panting. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, I went to the city hall and asked to see the building's old records. I discovered that several people had disappeared over the years, all of whom lived in the same building. All of the missing people had something in common. They were lonely and didn't have many friends or family. I returned to my apartment with my mind racing. I needed evidence, something concrete that would link Mr. Almeida to the disappearances. I waited until nightfall and, armed with a flashlight, decided to break into the antique shop. I knew I was taking a huge risk, but my curiosity and need for justice outweighed my fear. I managed to break down the back door and entered quietly. The shop was even more eerie at night. Shadows danced on the walls and every sound seemed amplified. I went to the basement where I figured I might find something. The basement was a maze of dark hallways and rooms filled with old objects. There was one locked room that caught my attention. I forced the lock and went inside. What I saw inside left me speechless. Photos of the building's former residents lined the walls, along with personal items that clearly belonged to them. It was a macabre shrine. In the center of the room sat an old trunk. I opened it and found more photos, including one of the woman who had appeared in my apartment. There were diaries and letters all detailing the lives of these people before they disappeared. A pattern began to emerge. Mr. Almeida would approach them, gain their trust, and then they would disappear. I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly and saw Mr. Almeida standing in the doorway, his gaze cold and calculating. "I thought you were too curious for your own good, Mariana," he said, his voice soft and menacing. My heart raced, but I tried to remain calm. "What did you do with these people?" I asked, stalling for time. He stepped forward, his eyes shining with a suppressed madness. "They were lonely, lost. I gave them purpose. I immortalized them in my collections. And you will be next." Terrified, I tried to run, but he was surprisingly fast. He grabbed me by the arm and threw me to the ground. I fought with all my strength, but he was stronger. I started screaming, hoping someone would hear me. Suddenly, the basement door was thrown open with a bang. Pedro, a neighbor I had recently met and told him about my suspicions, ran in, wielding a piece of wood. "Let her go now!" Pedro shouted, lunging at Mr. Almeida. The struggle was intense, but together we managed to subdue the old man. We tied up Mr. Almeida and called the police. When the officers arrived, they were horrified by what they found in the basement. Mr. Almeida was taken into custody, and the antique shop was sealed off for investigation. News of the disappearances and the macabre shrine spread quickly throughout the city. Everyone was shocked to discover what was hidden behind Mr. Almeida's friendly facade. However, the feeling of security would not return for a long time. Despite everything, the feeling of unease did not completely leave me. I returned to my apartment and tried to get my life back on track, but the nightmares persisted. The image of the woman in the photo and the nighttime whispers continued to haunt me. I knew the fight was not completely over. There was something in Mr. Almeida's house that needed to be solved, something that had yet to be discovered. Pedro and I committed to investigating further, to ensure that no sinister secrets remained hidden. Thus, my journey in the quiet little town was far from over. As long as there were mysteries to be revealed and injustices to be righted, I was ready to face the unknown. The House of the Forgotten may have been just the beginning, and I was prepared for the next battle, knowing that the true darkness was yet to come. Even though Mr. Almeida was in prison and his store was closed, the feeling of unease did not disappear. The nightmares became more frequent, and the shadows in my apartment seemed to take on a life of their own. I felt that something terrible was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Pedro and I decided to continue our investigation. We discovered that Mr. Almeida kept a warehouse outside the city. where he stored items that didn't fit in the store. We decided to explore the place, hoping to find more clues about the disappearances and perhaps a way to end the nightmares that haunted us. We arrived at the warehouse on a rainy afternoon. The place was huge, with rusty metal walls and broken windows that let in the howling wind. The door was locked, but Pedro managed to break it down. We entered, lighting the interior with flashlights. The warehouse was full of stacked boxes, old furniture, and objects of all kinds. There was an oppressive feeling in the air, as if the structure itself was permeated with evil. We started looking through the boxes, finding more photos, diaries, and personal items from Mr. Almeida's victims. Each discovery heightened our horror and the certainty that we were dealing with something beyond comprehension. As we investigated, we heard a sound coming from the back of the warehouse. It was a low, rhythmic noise, like soft tapping. We approached cautiously, feeling the air getting colder and thicker. We found a locked door, and the knocking was coming from inside. "We need to open this," Pedro said, his voice shaking. With effort, we managed to force the door. What we saw inside made my blood run cold. It was a small room, lit only by a lamp hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was an operating table stained with dried blood. Around it, rusty surgical instruments and photos of Senor Almeida's victims. On the opposite wall was a large mirror with an ornate gilded frame. The surface of the mirror was cracked, and a sense of evil emanated from it. As I approached, I felt an intense cold and a sensation of being pulled into the mirror. "Mariana, be careful," Pedro shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. The image reflected in the mirror began to distort, forming faces of pain and despair. They were the souls of the victims, trapped in eternal torment. I heard their whispers asking for help, begging to be freed. "We need to destroy this," said Pedro with determination. We took an iron bar that we found in the warehouse and started hitting the mirror. With each blow, the mirror seemed to scream and the room shook. Finally, with a loud crack, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and an intense light filled the room. We felt a wave of energy pass through us, and the whispers stopped. The souls of the victims were freed, but the terror was far from over. As we left the room, we heard a loud sound of something falling to the floor. We ran back to the main warehouse and saw that several boxes had fallen, revealing a secret passage in the floor. We went down the stairs and found a dark tunnel that seemed to go on forever. The atmosphere was suffocating, and every step we took echoed through the tunnel. At the end of the tunnel, we found a large room, full of strange symbols on the walls and an altar in the center. On the altar, there was an old book with a leather cover and yellowed pages. I took the book and started leafing through it, discovering that it was a grimoire, full of macabre rituals and spells. I realized that Mr. Almeida was not just a collector of antiques, but also practiced dark rituals. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly and saw an indistinct figure, like a shadow, watching us. Pedro screamed, and the figure rushed at him, throwing him against the wall. I rushed to help him, but the figure grabbed me, his hands cold as ice. I fought to free myself, reciting the prayer my grandmother had taught me. The figure retreated a little, but its strength was overwhelming. Pedro managed to get up and took the grimoire, starting to recite one of the rituals. "Laura, we need to finish this," he shouted, with desperation in his voice. Together we recite the words of the ritual, feeling the atmosphere around us change. The figure began to dissipate, screaming in agony. Finally, with one last breath, the figure disappeared, and the room fell silent. We left the tunnel, exhausted but relieved. We knew we had faced something terrible, but the evil had been banished. We returned to the main warehouse and found a way to seal the secret passage, ensuring that no one else could access that hellish place. The days that followed were filled with relief, but also reflection. Pedro and I knew that our fight was far from over. The city still had dark secrets, and we were determined to discover and confront them. We returned to our building and tried to get back to our lives, but the feeling of restlessness never completely went away. We knew that evil could return at any moment, and we needed to be prepared. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft whisper. It was the voice of one of the victims, thanking him for his release, but also warning of a new danger. I got up and looked out the window, seeing a shadowy figure on the street, watching my apartment. The fight against the unknown was far from over. Pedro and I committed to protecting our city and facing any threat that emerged. We knew there would be more battles ahead, and we were ready to face them together. The story of Senor Almeida and his antique shop may have come to an end, but the mysteries and horrors we encountered taught us that true darkness never completely disappears. And so, my journey continues, always in search of the truth, no matter how terrible it may be. In the quiet and seemingly perfect neighborhood of Villa Verde, the beauty of the gardens was a source of pride for all residents. However, no one stood out as much as Donna Rosa, a kind elderly woman whose garden was a true oasis of lush flowers and lush vegetation. Everyone in the community admired the hard work and dedication she put into every detail. But behind the serene appearance and gentle smile, there was a dark secret that would turn the lives of the residents into a living nightmare. My name is Daniel, and my wife Clara and I moved to Villa Verde about 6 months ago. We were excited about the idea of starting a new life in such a beautiful and welcoming place. Donna Rosa, our neighbor, was one of the first people to welcome us. She presented us with a bouquet of flowers from her garden, a simple gesture that felt sincere and kind. However, there was something in her eyes, something that made me uncomfortable from the start. At that time, I worked as a teacher and Clara as a nurse. Our lives were busy, but we found time to tend to our own garden. We often saw Donna Rosa on the other side of the fence, smiling and offering gardening advice. She always seemed to know exactly what to do to make the plants bloom. As time went by, we started to notice strange things. At night, disturbing sounds came from Donna Rosa's garden. There were noises that sounded like digging, followed by whispers that made our skin crawl. Clara thought it was just our imagination, but I knew something was wrong. One night, the smell in the air changed. It was an unpleasant odor, which became stronger as we approached Donna Rosa's garden. Clara suggested it could be a dead animal, but I was determined to find out the truth. I decided to investigate more closely without attracting too much attention. I waited until night had completely fallen. With a flashlight in my hand, I jumped the fence and approached Donna Rosa's garden. The flashlight light revealed magnificent plants, bright flowers, and lush vegetation, but the smell was still there, heavy and nauseating. I started digging in a far corner where the smell was stronger. To my horror, I unearthed a human bone. I returned home shaking, not knowing how to tell Clara. I knew we needed to do something, but how could we accuse such a respected neighbor without concrete evidence? We decided that I would come back during the day, pretending to be interested in gardening, to try and find more clues. The next day, I went to Donna Rosa and started talking about her garden. She was more than happy to show me around. As we walked among the plants, I saw her avoiding a specific area. I took advantage of a moment of distraction and approached that location. I found more bones, all buried shallowly. I told Clara, and we decided that we needed to involve the police. However, when the police arrived, Donna Rosa was prepared. She vehemently denied everything, showing off her impeccable garden and mocking our accusation. Without sufficient evidence, the police could do nothing. That night, I woke up to Clara shaking me. She was pale and terrified, saying that she had seen shadows moving in our garden. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. What I saw terrified me. Several figures with dirt-stained clothes were frantically digging. When they saw me, they disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a hole in which we found more bones. The situation was becoming untenable. I decided to confront Dona Rosa directly. I went to her house and she greeted me with a sinister smile. When I mentioned the bones, her smile disappeared and an expression of pure evil took over her face. "You shouldn't have intruded, Daniel," she said, her voice low and threatening. "Some secrets are better left buried." Before I could react, she attacked. I struggled to defend myself, but she was surprisingly strong for someone her age. I managed to push her back and ran out of her house, promising myself that I would expose her true nature. Back in the safety of our home, Clara and I began to plan. We knew we needed more evidence, something irrefutable that could incriminate her. We decided to watch Dona Rosa's garden every night, recording any suspicious activity. On the following nights, we filmed Dona Rosa performing macabre rituals in her garden, always under the light of the moon. The recordings clearly showed her burying human remains and speaking in an ancient and unknown language. With this evidence, we went to the police again. The police this time could not ignore what we saw. They returned to Dona Rosa's garden with search warrants. When excavating, they found several buried bodies, some already in advanced decomposition. Dona Rosa was arrested, shouting curses and threats at us. We thought the nightmare was over, but we were wrong. After Dona Rosa's arrest, our garden began to inexplicably wither. The plants died and the soil seemed poisoned. Clara and I felt an evil presence in our house, something we couldn't see but knew was there. One night while we were sleeping, I woke up to the sound of digging coming from the garden. I looked out the window and saw a hooded figure digging where our flower bed used to be. I grabbed the flashlight and ran outside, but the figure was gone, leaving behind a deep hole. Inside the hole, I found an old wooden box. When I opened it, I discovered a diary covered in dried blood, belonging to Dona Rosa. The diary contained horrific details about her practices, macabre rituals, and a pact with something very ancient and evil. I discovered that she had made a deal to guarantee the fertility of her garden in exchange for human lives. The last pages of the diary mentioned one last sacrifice, something she had not completed before her arrest. Clara and I were her last ritual pieces. We knew that Dona Rosa's evil influence was still present, trying to complete what she had started. In the days that followed, strange things continued to happen. Objects moved on their own. Whispers echoed through the house and shadows danced on the walls. We felt that Dona Rosa's spirit was haunting us, determined to complete her ritual. We decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We packed our things and moved into a hotel temporarily while we looked for a new home away from Villa Verde. However, we knew that it would not be easy to escape the evil we had awakened. On our last day at the house, as we were finishing packing, I heard a sound coming from the garden. I went out to investigate and saw a hooded figure standing at the edge of the hole I found earlier. The figure raised its head, revealing Dona Rosa's face, but younger and more sinister. "You can't escape me," she said, her voice echoing unearthly. I ran inside, shouting to Clara that we needed to leave immediately. We grabbed what we could and ran to the car. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the figure of Dona Rosa, now surrounded by shadows that stretched across the street. We knew this battle was far from over. The evil she had awakened still followed us, and our fight against the darkness was just beginning. Each night was a new struggle to maintain our sanity, each shadow a reminder that true terror was always lurking. Dona Rosa may have been arrested, but her legacy of terror continued to haunt us. The feeling that we would never truly be safe haunted us, and we knew that eventually we would have to face evil head-on again. The story of Villa Verde and its garden of blood was far from over, and we were determined to survive the nightmare that awaited us. Our escape to the hotel brought only temporary relief. The nights were still filled with nightmares and sinister whispers. We felt that Dona Rosa's shadow was always with us, even far from Villa Verde. Clara and I were exhausted, both physically and mentally, and we knew we needed to find a permanent solution. One morning when I woke up, I found an anonymous note slipped under the door of our hotel room. It simply said, "She's not under arrest. Find the truth in the old Pedras Negras sanatorium." The note put me on alert. If Donna Rosa wasn't arrested, where was she really? Clara and I decided to follow the trail. Piedras Negras was a small, isolated town known for its horror stories about an abandoned sanatorium. We got in the car and drove there, feeling an oppressive weight as we approached our destination. The sanatorium sat atop a hill, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to whisper dark secrets. Upon arriving, we found the place in complete abandonment. The windows were broken, and the dilapidated structure seemed ready to collapse. However, there were signs of recent activity: footprints in the mud, remains of campfires, and even tire tracks. We entered cautiously, trying not to make any noise. The inside of the sanatorium was even scarier than the outside. The walls were covered in mold, and the smell of rot permeated the air. As we walked through the dark hallways, we heard sounds that made our skin crawl: distant moans, low laughter, and footsteps that seemed to follow us. In one of the rooms, we found evidence that someone had been living there. There was a makeshift bed, dirty clothes, and a desk strewn with papers. We rummaged through the documents and discovered old medical records, including a name that made our blood run cold: Rosa Antunes. She had been admitted there decades ago, diagnosed with serious mental disorders. The file mentioned experimental treatments and a possible escape that was never confirmed. The situation became increasingly sinister. We continued exploring until we found a room that appeared to be an old treatment room. In the center was a restraint chair, with leather belts still attached. On the wall, an inscription in dried blood: "The garden needs more blood." Suddenly, we heard footsteps approaching. We hid behind an old torn curtain, peering out to see who was coming. To our horror, we saw Donna Rosa enter the room, accompanied by two men who seemed to be accomplices in her crimes. "We need to complete the ritual tonight," she said, her voice thick with malice. "Those two must be next." Clara and I looked at each other, feeling the panic growing. We needed to get out of there before we were captured. I waited until they left the room and signaled to Clara that it was time to escape. We tried to make as little noise as possible, but the wooden floor creaked beneath our feet, and the tension was almost unbearable. When we reached the exit, we heard a voice behind us. "Did you think you could escape so easily?" We turned and saw Donna Rosa, her eyes shining with hatred. The men who accompanied her advanced towards us, and we began to run through the labyrinthine corridors of the sanatorium. The sound of their footsteps echoed, and the feeling that they were right behind us was terrifying. Finally, we found a door that led outside. We ran into the forest, the darkness enveloping us. We could hear the screams of Donna Rosa and her accomplices, but we kept running, guided only by the moonlight. The forest seemed alive, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to grab us. We stumbled several times, but we couldn't stop. When we finally reached the car, Clara was in tears and I was shaking with fear and exhaustion. We drove as fast as we could without looking back. Back at the hotel, we locked the door and tried to catch our breath. The situation was getting worse and we knew we couldn't keep running. We decided we had to face Donna Rosa once and for all. Clara suggested we go back to the garden in Villa Verde and destroy the altar where she performed her rituals. The next night, armed with tools and determination, we returned to our old house. The garden was quiet, but the evil presence was palpable. We began digging around the altar, trying to unearth the evil that Donna Rosa had planted there. We found bones, amulets, and strange symbols buried in the ground. Suddenly, the shadows around us began to move. We heard whispers and malevolent laughter. Clara held my hand and I felt her fear match my own. We continued digging until we finally found a large wooden coffin. We opened the coffin with difficulty, revealing a human skeleton. The inscriptions around it indicated that this was the body of someone used as a sacrifice to carry out Donna Rosa's rituals. We felt a wave of evil energy emanating from the coffin, and the figure of Donna Rosa appeared before us, younger and more sinister than ever. "You cannot stop me," she said, her voice echoing with malice. "My work is far from finished." Holding Donna Rosa's diary that we found in the sanatorium, I began to recite the banishing rituals she had recorded, hoping to undo the evil she had created. Clara sprinkled salt around the coffin, trying to create a protective barrier. The battle that followed was intense. Donna Rosa attacked with supernatural strength, and we felt terror take hold of us. But we did not give up. We continued to recite the words from the diary until an intense light began to emanate from the coffin. Donna Rosa's figure screamed in agony, disappearing in a cloud of shadows. As the light dimmed, we felt a strange calm in the air. The garden was quiet, and the evil presence seemed to have been banished. We buried the remains with a silent prayer, hoping that this would bring peace to the tormented souls. We returned to the hotel, exhausted but relieved. We thought the nightmare was over, but we knew that Donna Rosa's shadow could still be lurking, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The feeling that we would never truly be safe accompanied us, but we were determined to keep fighting. The battle against the evil of Villa Verde was far from over, and we knew that our fight for peace and security would be long and arduous. True terror was always present, but we were ready to face any challenge that came our way. The story of Donna Rosa and her garden of blood was a constant reminder that evil can hide in the most unexpected places, and that true courage is to face it head-on, whatever the cost. The nights that followed our attempt to banish evil from the garden were dark and full of uncertainty. Clara and I still couldn't sleep without the constant fear that Donna Rosa's shadow would come back to haunt us. The feeling of oppression, although lessened, still hung over us. We were on the verge of mental and physical exhaustion. One night, as we tried to find some relief from a restless sleep, I was awakened by a disturbing sound. It was a whisper, low and persistent, that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Clara also woke up, her eyes wide with fear. The whispering began to intensify, turning into a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and our breath turned to mist before us. The shadows on the walls began to twist and take grotesque shapes. Clara grabbed my hand tightly, her fingers as cold as ice. Then, the figure of Donna Rosa appeared in the corner of the room, her presence more threatening than ever. "Did you think you could stop me?" Her voice echoed, full of malice. "My work is far from finished. You will be next." The figure slowly advanced, each step echoing like thunder in the dead silence. I tried to move, but it felt like my feet were glued to the floor. Clara began to mutter a prayer, her words trembling with fear. The figure of Donna Rosa raised a skeletal hand, and I felt a crushing pressure in my chest. It was difficult to breathe, and terror paralyzed me. The shadows approached like tentacles of darkness trying to envelop us. I remembered Donna Rosa's diary that we had left in the garden. We needed those banishing words again, but the diary was miles away, buried beneath the garden's poisoned soil. "Clara, we have to go back to the garden," I managed to whisper, fighting against the crushing pressure. Clara nodded, her eyes full of determination despite her fear. With a supreme effort, we got up and ran out of the hotel without looking back. We got in the car and drove frantically back to our old house, feeling Donna Rosa's presence following us every kilometer. We reached the garden and began desperately digging where we had buried the diary. The shadows around us intensified, and we could hear Donna Rosa's sinister laugh echoing in the night. Finally, I found the diary and began reciting the banishing words with all my strength. Light began to emanate from the ground, illuminating the garden with blinding intensity. The shadows retreated, and Donna Rosa's figure screamed in agony, dissolving into a dark mist. But even as her figure disappeared, I felt that something was still deeply wrong. The earth beneath our feet began to tremble, and a crack opened in the ground. From the hole, a skeletal hand emerged, followed by a decomposing body. It was as if all the souls that Donna Rosa had sacrificed were trying to emerge, seeking revenge or freedom. The terror reached its peak when we realized that we were not just dealing with Donna Rosa, but with all the evil entities that she had awakened. We ran back to the car, but it wouldn't start. The engine was dead, and the darkness around us closed like an oppressive cloak. The skeletal figures began to crawl towards us, their empty eyes fixed on us. "We won't be able to get out of here," Clara shouted, the desperation in her voice clear. It was then that an intense, pure light appeared from the sky, illuminating the garden and burning away the shadows around us. The skeletal figures retreated, dissolving into thin air. In the center of the light, an ethereal figure appeared. It was like a vision of purity and goodness, opposed to the evil we faced. The figure raised a hand, and I felt a wave of warmth and peace wash over me. The shadows disappeared completely, and the garden became silent. "You fought bravely," the figure said, his voice soft and comforting. "But the evil you face will not be easily defeated. Keep fighting. Never give up on the light." With those words, the figure disappeared, leaving us in peaceful silence. We knew the battle was far from over, but now we had new hope. We returned to the hotel, exhausted but determined to keep fighting. Donna Rosa's true terror had been faced, but we were aware that evil can take many forms and that our fight for peace and security was just beginning. The story of Villa Verde and its Garden of Blood was a constant reminder that evil can hide in the most unexpected places, and that true courage is to face it head on, whatever the cost. Thus, our lives continued, marked by horror, but also by the determination to never give up. We were ready for any challenge that came our way, knowing that the light of hope and courage would always shine, even on the darkest nights. In the tranquility of a peaceful neighborhood, where the days drag on in the monotony of everyday life, and the nights are silenced by the murmur of crickets, a young woman seeks to restart her life. Mariana, tired of the hustle and bustle of the big city, finds refuge in a cozy apartment with friendly neighbors and tree-lined streets. However, the apparent peace hides a dark secret, embodied in the figure of the silent and observant neighbor. This is the story of how Mariana's curiosity and suspicion led her to a terrifying confrontation with the reality hidden behind the walls of her new home. My name is Mariana, and a few months ago, I moved into a quiet apartment in a neighborhood that seemed perfect to start my life over again. The place had a welcoming feel, with friendly neighbors and quiet streets. I was eager to leave the chaos of the big city behind and find some peace. Little did I know that the greatest terror of my life was lurking behind the thin walls of my new home. On the first day, I met Donna Isabel, my neighbor from the next apartment. An old lady with a kind smile and a seemingly harmless presence. She introduced herself with a welcome cake, and I thought her attitude was adorable. "Welcome, dear. Anything you need, I'll be here," she said, in a soft voice that almost made me relax. At first, our interaction was limited to brief greetings in the hallway and small talk about the weather, but soon I started noticing strange behavior. Donna Isabel seemed to always be present, as if she knew exactly when I was leaving or arriving. I began to feel like her eyes were constantly on me even when she wasn't visible. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a soft whisper coming from the wall. Initially, I thought it was my imagination, but the whispers continued as if someone was trying to talk to me on the other side. I got up and put my ear to the wall, but I couldn't make out any words. Fear began to creep in, but I decided to ignore it, thinking it was just noises from the old building. The days turned into weeks, and the feeling of being watched only increased. I started finding things out of place in my apartment. Objects that I was sure I had left in a specific place appeared in other corners. One time, my coffee table book was open to a page I didn't remember reading. The other day, my hairbrush was found in the bathroom when I always left it in the bedroom. I told a few people about my worries, but they all said it was just the stress of moving. Even my best friend Luisa, who came to visit me, thought I was exaggerating. "You're imagining things, Mari. Change is difficult, but you will adapt," she said, trying to reassure me. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. One night I woke up with the feeling that someone was in my room. I opened my eyes quickly and saw a shadow move around the corner. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned on the light. but there was no one there. I spent the rest of the night awake with all my senses on alert. Things started to get worse. One morning when I opened the door to get the newspaper, I found an anonymous letter. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant, and the content terrified me. "I know everything about you, Mariana. I'm always watching." My blood ran cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Who could have written that? I decided to install security cameras in my apartment, hoping to find out what was going on. The following nights were filled with anxiety as I waited for answers. Finally, one morning, while reviewing the recordings, I saw something that horrified me. Donna Isabel, my seemingly harmless neighbor, was entering my apartment with an extra key and going through my things. Anger and fear mixed in my mind. How did she have a key to my apartment? I decided to confront her, but I needed to make sure she was safe. I called Luisa and asked her to come and help me. When Luisa arrived, I explained the situation and showed the recordings. "This is insane, Mari. We need to confront this woman," said Luisa, visibly scared. We went to Donna Isabel's apartment and knocked on the door. She opened with the same gentle smile as always, but there was something sinister in her eyes. "Hello, Mariana. What can I do for you?" she asked, as if nothing was wrong. "I know what you're doing, Donna Isabel. I saw the recordings. You have a key to my apartment and you're getting in when I'm not there. Why?" My voice shook with anger and fear. Donna Isabel's smile slowly disappeared. "You shouldn't have found out, Mariana. Everything I did was to protect you," she said, her voice cold and distant. "Protect me? Dan?" I asked, unable to hide my terror. "Of the things that live in the shadows, of the entities that want to hurt you. I watch you to make sure you're safe," she replied with a disturbing look. Before we could respond, Donna Isabel closed the door tightly. We ran back to my apartment trying to understand what she had said. "This is crazy, Mari. We need to call the police," suggested Luisa, taking out her phone. But before we could do anything, we heard a loud noise coming from the room. We ran to see what it was and found all my things scattered across the floor, as if someone had ransacked the place in seconds. The cameras were off and the feeling of oppression was overwhelming. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. I went to the building administration and asked about Donna Isabel's background. I discovered that she had lived there for over 20 years, and that she had a reputation for being a strange but harmless neighbor. However, one of the administrators mentioned that she had lost her daughter in a tragic accident, and that since then, her sanity seemed to have been affected. I returned home with more questions than answers. Luisa and I decided to enter Donna Isabel's apartment while she was away. We used the extra key she kept hidden under the rug. Upon entering, we were greeted by a strong, musty smell and an environment full of old things. There were pictures of a young girl everywhere, and several of them were placed on makeshift altars with worn-out candles. We went to the room and found an old diary. In the yellowed pages, Donna Isabel wrote about her daughter and how she believed she was still alive, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. The last few pages talked about me, detailing my movements and habits, as if I were a replacement for his lost daughter. Before we could leave, we heard the apartment door open. Panic took over us. We hid in the closet, trying not to make any noise. I heard heavy footsteps and Donna Isabel's voice murmuring incomprehensible things. The tension was unbearable, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought she could hear it. Donna Isabel entered the room and started looking for something. Her breathing was heavy and the feeling of imminent danger grew. Luisa squeezed my hand, trying to calm me down, but I was in pure terror. Suddenly, the closet was opened, and Donna Isabel's eyes met mine. "I warned you not to interfere, Mariana," she said with a coldness that made my blood run cold. Before she could do anything, Luisa and I pushed the closet door hard, knocking it down. We ran out of the apartment, hearing Donna Isabel's angry screams behind us. We arrived at my apartment and locked the door, trying to catch our breath. "We need to get out of here, Mari. Now," said Luisa with a trembling voice. As we were quickly packing our bags, we heard violent knocking on the door. "You can't run away from me," shouted Donna Isabel, with a voice full of hatred. Terror gripped me, but we knew we couldn't stay. We ran to the emergency exit, but when we reached the hallway, we saw Donna Isabel coming towards us with a knife in her hand. The situation was desperate and every second counted. We managed to lock the emergency door behind us, but we knew it wouldn't take long for her to reach us. We ran down the stairs, feeling the oppressive presence of Donna Isabel chasing us. When we finally reached the exit of the building, we ran into the street, shouting for help. Neighbors began to come out of their homes, alarmed by the screams. The police arrived quickly, thanks to calls from neighbors. Donna Isabel was detained, but the terror in her eyes made it clear that she was not finished. "I will come back for you, Mariana," she whispered as she was led away by the police. The feeling of relief was brief. Although Donna Isabel was in custody, I knew that the terror she had brought into my life would not go away so easily. Luisa and I moved to a safe place, but the feeling of being watched never completely left me. As I write these words, I still feel the oppressive presence of Donna Isabel. The police found more diaries in her apartment, detailing plans to protect me from the shadows. They also discovered that she had several keys to apartments in the building, and that she had invaded other people's lives before me. Donna Isabel's battle against insanity may be over, but fear and paranoia continue to haunt me. I know I need to stay vigilant, because even though she is trapped, the memory of her cold eyes and threatening voice still haunts me. My life will never be the same. The tranquility I sought when moving into that apartment turned into a nightmare from which I will never fully wake up. I continue living, trying to find normality but always vigilant, always waiting for the next move from Donna Isabel, or someone like her. And so, my story continues, marked by terror and paranoia. I know the darkness never completely disappears, and the battle for my peace of mind is constant. I hope that one day, finally, I can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround me. In the days following Donna Isabel's arrest, Luisa and I tried to regain some semblance of normality. We moved again to a new apartment in a different city, but the feeling of being watched never completely went away. The voices and whispers continued to torment us, and the oppression of the shadows was a constant in our lives. One night, after a particularly stressful day, I decided to take a hot bath to try and relax. As the water fell on me, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside the bathroom. Initially, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sound persisted, getting louder and more insistent. I got out of the shower, got dressed quickly, and opened the bathroom door. The hallway was empty, but the sense of imminent danger was palpable. "Luisa?" I called, my voice echoing through the house. There was no response. I walked around the house calling for Luisa, but she was nowhere to be found. Panic began to set in. I picked up my cell phone and tried to call her, but the phone was dead. It was then that I noticed a message on the screen. "Come to the basement, need you." My heart skipped a beat. The building we lived in had an old, rarely used basement. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs with a growing sense of dread. The cellar door was ajar, and a draft of cold air rushed past me as I pushed it open. Inside the basement, the darkness was almost total. My flashlight only illuminated a small area ahead, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my rapid breathing. I called out for Luisa again, but all I heard was the echo of my own voice. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I tried to turn it on again, but it wouldn't respond. It was then that I felt a presence behind me. I quickly turned around but didn't see anything. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw a shadowy figure at the bottom of the cellar. The figure seemed to float, its eyes glowing with an ominous light. "You will never be safe, Mariana," said the figure in a voice that seemed to come from all sides at once. Absolute terror gripped me, but I knew I needed to find Luisa. I began to move towards the figure, my breathing becoming heavier and heavier. The figure disappeared into the darkness, and I continued forward, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being pulled into an endless abyss. Suddenly, I tripped over something on the floor and fell to my knees. When I illuminated it with a little light from the flashlight, I saw that it was Louisa, unconscious and with strange marks on her body. "Louisa!" I shouted, shaking her to try and wake her up. It was then that the shadowy figure reappeared, now closer, its eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. "She's mine now," whispered the figure, and I felt an invisible force push me back. I fought against the force, trying to reach Louisa, but it was as if an invisible barrier was between us. The shadowy figure approached Louisa, and I saw that her hands turned into sharp claws. "No!" I screamed, feeling hopelessness take over me. In a last desperate effort, I grabbed the flashlight and threw it at the figure. The lantern broke into 1,000 pieces, and an intense, momentary light illuminated the cellar. The figure let out a horrible scream and disappeared, but the sense of danger was still there. I ran to Louisa and took her in my arms, trying to take her out of the basement. I ran up the stairs as quickly as I could, feeling the dark presence behind me with every step. When I finally reached the basement door, I locked it and threw myself on the floor, trying to catch my breath. Louisa began to wake up, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice weak. "It does not matter now. We need to get out of here," I replied, helping her to her feet. We left the building that same night, leaving everything behind. We drove aimlessly, trying to escape the feeling of oppression that haunted us. We knew we would never truly be safe, but we had to try. As I write these words, we are in a small motel, trying to decide our next move. The terror is still present, and the feeling of being watched never completely disappears. The voices and whispers continue to torment us, and the shadows seem to take on a life of their own. I know that the battle against the forces of darkness is far from over. I continue my vigil, determined to protect myself and Louisa. The terror never truly ends, and darkness will always be lurking, ready to strike again. And so my story continues, marked by fear and paranoia. I know that the fight for my mental peace is constant, and I hope that one day, finally, I can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround me. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears. In an attempt to find some peace, Louisa and I decided to move to a distant city, hoping that physical distance could bring us some psychological relief. We chose a small town in the interior, surrounded by dense forests and mountains. We rented an old but charming house on the outskirts of town, trying to start over. In the first few days, the tranquility of the place seemed to work. The house was cozy and the neighborhood was friendly. However, before long, the feeling of being watched intensified again. One night while we were having dinner, we heard knocking on the back door. When I opened it, there was no one there. Louisa was pale, but we tried to convince ourselves that it was just the wind or some animal. The tension increased when we started finding messages written in different parts of the house. They were phrases like, "You're not safe and I'll be back." The lyrics were shaky and childish, but the effect was devastating. We decided to install new locks and reinforce security, but the psychological terror was consuming us. One night, during a storm, the lights in the house began to flicker. Louisa was upstairs and I was in the living room when I heard heavy footsteps downstairs. Terrified, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and started climbing the stairs. In the hallway, I found Louisa, pale and shaking. "Mariana, I saw someone in the bathroom mirror," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. We locked ourselves in the room, trying to think of a solution. The knocking on doors and windows became more intense, and whispers echoed through the walls. I picked up my cell phone and called the police, but the line was dead. We were alone, surrounded by a presence that seemed to want to drive us crazy. Suddenly, the lights went out and the silence became deafening. The darkness was oppressive, and each shadow seemed to take on a life of its own. We sat on the floor, back to back, trying to stay calm. "We'll get out of here as soon as the storm passes," said Louisa, her voice shaking. But before we could make any plans, the bedroom door opened with a bang. A shadowy figure stood at the entrance, its eyes shining with an ominous light. "You can't run away," said the figure in a voice that seemed to come from all sides at once. Absolute terror gripped me. The figure slowly advanced, and I felt an invisible force holding us in place. Louisa screamed and tried to get up, but the shadowy figure pushed her against the wall with supernatural strength. "She is mine now," whispered the figure, its sharp claws gleaming in the dim light. In a last desperate effort, I grabbed the knife and threw it at the figure. To my surprise, the knife passed straight through it as if it were made of mist. The figure laughed, a sound that made my blood run cold. "You don't understand, you can't hurt me," she said, moving forward again. We knew our only chance was to escape. With a strength I didn't know I had, I pushed Louisa out of the room and we ran down the hallway. The figure followed us, its oppressive presence cornering us with every step. We reached the basement and locked ourselves inside, trying to find a way out. At the bottom of the basement, I found an old, rusty door. With a tremendous effort, we managed to open it and go out into the back garden. The storm was still raging, but the feeling of freedom was intoxicating. We ran into the forest, trying to get as far away from the house as possible. However, as we looked back, we saw the shadowy figure following us, floating above the ground. We knew we had no escape. We ran into town, screaming for help. Finally, we found a group of neighbors who called the police. The police quickly arrived and investigated the house, but found nothing. They said we were imagining things due to stress, but Louisa and I knew the truth. That shadowy figure was not a figment of our imagination. We decided to leave the city and move to an even more distant place, hoping to finally find peace. But the terror did not end. The shadowy figure continues to haunt us, appearing in our dreams and sometimes in our daily lives. I know that the battle against the forces of darkness is far from over. I continue my vigil, determined to protect myself and Louisa. The terror never truly ends, and darkness will always be lurking, ready to strike again. And so my story continues, marked by fear and paranoia. I know that the fight for my mental peace is constant, and I hope that one day, finally, I can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround me. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears.